While I'm recording this, the jet stream has dipped down significantly over North America, and we are in single digits, which is exactly how I felt while watching Titanic when Jack and Rose are in the water. James Cameron's Titanic came out in 1997, 25 years ago, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, Billy Zane, the late Bill Paxton, Kathy Bates. This cast is absolutely huge. You guys know the plot of this movie. It's a story of this young woman named Rose who is on board the Titanic, supposed to marry this rich guy named Cal Hockley, and then she meets this free-spirited young man named Jack Dawson who basically sets her free and causes her to go on her own adventure instead of being confined by her rich lifestyle. I'm rolling up my sleeves on this one because I actually have some things to say here. You know, I gotta be honest, I was a little bit embarrassed to talk about this movie for so long. I have shared in some of my Blu-ray collection videos that you can laugh at me all you want, but I love Titanic. I still feel that way in some ways, but you know what? I kinda don't really care. If you wanna scoff at me or call me less of a man for loving Titanic, I simply don't care. I'm gonna go as far as to say it's one of my all-time favorites. I wouldn't call it my favorite James Cameron film though. That title still belongs to Terminator 2. But this movie had a really interesting way of captivating its audience with the romance, mostly for the ladies. But I think even some guys can actually find it acceptable because the romance, as we'll talk about, it is very much a puppy love type of romance, but it's one of those things where I think it's very compelling in its own right, that you feel like it is building towards something. It's not an obnoxious type of Hallmark thing. Nothing against Hallmark movies. They're not really my thing. I know some people are into them, but I'm not, obviously. I'm not the target demographic for that stuff. That's a whole nother thing. It's like The Great Gatsby. The rich girls don't marry poor boys, yet in so many ways, they're a perfect match for each other. But it's also the 180 turn that the film takes once it hits the iceberg, and it turns into a disaster movie, which to this day still makes my jaw drop, showing people falling off the ships, firing guns at each other, trying to cut the ropes of the lifeboats, and yet somehow it doesn't feel jarring. It feels like a perfect blend of all of these things. From the opening of the movie, where we see the footage of the Titanic leaving Southampton with a sepia tone effect, and the music by the late James Horner, lets you know right away that the film's gonna have a really big sense of tragedy to it, considering the historical event that it's telling. If you don't know that the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank into the bottom of the Atlantic, how are you not paying attention in history class, or how did you not read a book about it? This movie really got me into the history of the Titanic. I had plenty of books that were made for elementary school kids, including one called Ghostliners, where it chronicles the events of the Titanic's voyage up until the sinking. I don't know where I put them exactly, but I know they're in one of my boxes somewhere. Besides the tragicness of the whole thing, there's a sense of awe and wonder that James Cameron brings to this movie because the Titanic is often viewed in our society or in pop culture as very mythic and legendary, that when we see the wreck of the ship at the bottom of the ocean, Bill Paxton's reaction when he sees the wreckage, we as the audience start to feel his awe. Yet as opposed to someone like Robert Ballard, who famously discovered the wreck of the Titanic, he's not in it really to explore the wreckage. He's really in it to find this lost artifact, or this lost diamond, the heart of the ocean. He tells this news reporter as he's discovering these things, which catches the attention of this older woman who's later revealed to be Rose, played by Gloria Stewart. She gets in touch with him and his crew, and she explains the story of what happened with her on her voyage up until the night of the sinking. It almost has like a steady feel to it, where you're kind of writing it out, seeing where this film goes, and then when it transitions to the past, that's when the film gets really exciting. And I think it kind of keeps in line with how this movie performed at the box office, and with critics and audiences. The ticket sales were fairly steady, but then, within about a week, it exploded. The film's success came out of nowhere. Nominated and won several Oscars, including Best Director for James Cameron, and for many years, it held the title of the most financially successful film at the box office until 2009, when Avatar took over. And then 10 years after that, Avengers Endgame took that title, which
I'm sure it's well deserved.
I think a lot of guys in my age group, or maybe even younger, can relate to this. If I were out in public and Titanic came up in conversation, I would say, oh my god, that's such a chick flick. What guy would like that? Yet in private, when you see Jack die and Rose is trying to wake him up, I go, no, please, please, bring him the door. Please, don't let him die.
right.
But I guess as I've gotten older, I just kind of reached a point where I don't really care what anybody says, if I like something or not. It's not always easy, but I like to feel like I'm making progress. And when we meet Rose and Jack in Southampton, Rose arrives with her mother and her fiance Cal, who's got a lot of possessions and goods since he comes from a rich background, as it's narrated by Gloria Stewart.
Outwardly, I was everything a well-brought-up girl should be. Inside, I was screaming.
The look on Rose's face says it all, yet she feels like she can't exactly walk her way out of it. And James Cameron, I think, does a really great job of setting up the introduction to Rose. The car comes in, blowing its horn, girl turns around and sees who it is, then you see her hand come out, and then she lifts her head as we see underneath her hat. I was 7 years old when I saw this movie. My mom took me to see it, I think, several months after the initial release. She was very trusting with me as a child, even with the nude scene and the sex scene that happens later in the car. I never really thought much of it at the time, and I was just too busy being wowed by the size of the ship and everything. Your mind operates differently at that age. But I certainly do remember being entranced by the beauty of Kate Winslet, because she is a beautiful woman. And a very talented woman, I must say. Then we have the introduction of Jack Dawson, who's playing a poker game trying to win some tickets to get on the Titanic, with his friend Fabrizio, played by Danny Nucci. Sorry, Fabrizio. Okay, sorry, motherfucker, you bet all our money!
We're going to America. Full house, boys! No!
There is a sense of irony that I feel, and I think other people have felt it too. Those two guys who lost the game, I've always wondered what their reactions were when they found out the news about the sinking later on. They probably thought, you know what, we were much better off. The excitement in the eyes of Fabrizio and Jack really conveys the sense of adventure that James Cameron is able to illustrate with this movie. The music by James Horner really heightens this sense of excitement and adventurous feel. The shot of the propeller starting up, the ship going by a small sailboat that's nearby in the harbor. I'm going to be saying this a lot. There are just so many shots and so many moments in this movie that I just watch it in complete awe. James Cameron, for someone who did movies like Aliens and Terminator and True Lies, this was a huge departure for him. And yet somehow he was able to pull it off. Not to mention the whole I'm the king of the world scene, which is probably the most famous scene in the movie, if not one of the most famous scenes. You could argue that it's very cornball and really obnoxious, but I love it. And I think Leonardo DiCaprio sells it 100%. This was the movie that really got him on the map for Hollywood. He was already Oscar nominated for Gilbert Grape, and he was already somewhat famous in the show Growing Pains with Kirk Cameron at the time, but this is the movie that really pushed him to this level of stardom that he's at right now, and he hasn't dropped off since. I've heard him say in interviews that he's embarrassed by this movie. Dude, you're being too hard on yourself. Be proud of this. This movie is a huge part of where you're at right now. There's no shame in that. There's also quite a bit of side characters that are shown in this movie that I wish that we got more time with them, but it would have been a lot more to pack into the movie, obviously. Tommy, the Irishman, who's probably my favorite side character in this whole movie. 50,000 Irishmen built it. Solid as a rock. Big Irish hands. But eventually when Jack and Rose meet at the back of the ship, when she tries to jump off the Titanic to commit suicide, I love this scene. Jack is playing it very level-headed. He's not acting all hysterical. He knows, like any other normal person would know, in order to talk somebody out of a hysterical state of mind, you gotta be very level-headed and very smooth and laid back. Because being hysterical just like they are, it's not gonna help them. Slowly taking off his clothes, talking about how cold the water is, knives stabbing you all over your body, which there was a documentary I saw on the History Channel some time ago. I think it was the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking. It was talking about what happens to the human body when you're dumped in ice cold water at that temperature. Just the thought of that makes me shake. Ooh. But inevitably, Rose decides not to commit suicide, and she's obviously very intrigued by this guy, so she wants to get to know him, and the connection starts to blossom as she discovers that he's an artist and he likes to draw certain people that he sees, or that he knows, but he inspires her to chase after what she wants to do, heading out to the horizon whenever she feels like it. Drink cheap beer, ride on the roller coaster till we throw up, even at one point teaching her how to spit. On paper, that would sound really stupid and make you go, oh my god, what? But somehow, DiCaprio and Winslet managed to sell it. And the chemistry between the two of them, it's already been said, they feel so natural together. It feels like a real couple. And the fact that they're best friends in real life, that more or less helped. But the scene I've always liked with Jack is when he's telling everybody at the dinner table what his attitude is about life, how he likes to wake up in the morning not knowing who he's gonna meet, where he's gonna end up. Almost kind of reminds me of what Tom Hanks said in Castaway. Tomorrow the sun's gonna come up, and you never know what the tide's gonna bring you. In a lot of ways, it makes me reflect on my own life choices and how I look to things going forward. And for a long time, I always thought that I was never gonna be able to have what I desired deep down, or at least get a chance to experience something that I've wanted. A lot of that is basically letting things come naturally to you, while also going out into the world and seeking what you want. Basically, the moral of the story is, don't waste the life that's given to you. You're here to learn something, you're here to experience something. Make the most of it. Because before you know it, your life's gonna be gone. And with certain things I've experienced in the past couple of years, looking forward to the future, not really sure if I'll ever be able to have some of the things that I would desire deep down, that monologue actually gives me some hope. You never really know what tomorrow's gonna bring your way. And then we get the best scene in the movie as far as I'm concerned, the Irish party scene. It's the one moment that Rose can actually let her guard down and she can finally feel like she can be herself. She's not confined by all the rich people or controlled by her fiance. She can take a drink like any normal person would. She stands on her tippy toes, which she hasn't done at that point apparently in a long time. With all the pop songs on the radio these days, this music is the kind of music that makes me want to dance. But obviously that doesn't really sit well with her fiance, who has his bodyguard spy on her, who I really like was at least one person that could see holes in Rose's story, how she was leaning far over to see the propellers. She slipped so suddenly and you still had time to remove your jackets and your shoes. I've always liked that little detail, because anybody who has a brainstem would be able to see, hold on a minute, something's not adding up. Let's talk about Billy Zane as Cal. He's probably one of the biggest jerks I've ever seen in film. Cal is a very controlling person. He's very wealthy, but is also very dominant in his own ways. Has a sense of power that he likes to lord over Rose, which makes her feel like she can't get out of it, but eventually she's able to break away from him, thankfully. And Billy Zane obviously had a few famous parts before Titanic. Memphis Belle, also one of Biff's henchmen in the original Back to the Future. And I also believe he was in a movie called Phantom. Never saw it, and I don't think I plan to. When I think of Billy Zane, Titanic comes to mind, for obvious reasons. He's all about number one. Doesn't really care about anybody else. Always finds a way to squeak his way out of a situation with his money, and that probably makes him feel like he can do anything. Later on, when Rose explains to her mother that there's not enough lifeboats for all the people on board, best case scenario,
half the people on this ship are going to die.
Not the better half.
wow. Wow. I know people like that exist in real life. That still floors me. But the thing about Rose is when she eventually starts to come into her own, no longer feeling like she has to obey the orders of the people around her in her life. This is the example of a strong female protagonist done correctly. One thing that James Cameron is really consistent at, and other people have mentioned this, strong female protagonists in his films. Sarah Connor in Terminator, Neytiri in Avatar, Ripley in Aliens, and even Jamie Lee Curtis in True Lies. I think in this movie, Rose is like a meld of Sarah Connor from T1 and T2. She starts off very meek and very shy, not really willing to stand up for herself, but then a certain point happens. She starts to become more and more tough. She's carrying this axe through the water as she's trying to save Jack in this hallway below deck, which, by the way, real quick, that is probably my favorite tracking shot in this movie, if that's really a thing. I'm not an expert in film or anything, but every little detail about this moment still captivates me. Her reaction to the cold water going in, making her way down by hanging onto this pipe carrying the axe, the way James Cameron places the camera in front of her and behind her, it's a genius move on Cameron's part, trying to make you feel like you're in the water with Rose trying to make her way back to Jack. But the midway point where we see her become more like the Sarah Connor from Terminator 2 is when she decides to obey her mother, who feels that her marriage to Cal will ensure their survival financially. But then she sees this young girl being taught how to sit, how to dress appropriately, and she realizes that no, this isn't what I want. She goes to Jack, who's on the bow of the ship, and we get the famous, I'm flying, Jack. Very sappy, and people have made fun of it, but it's Titanic. Get over yourselves. Not to mention we get that really beautiful shot as it swerves around the ship, and we see the two of them on the bow, and the choir sounds playing. Oh my god. That's the kind of scene that you show in a film studies class. The romance continues to blossom as they escape from David Warner's character, get into the car, and do the you-know-what. Then they have the drawing scene where she wears the necklace around her, and you know what, I gotta be honest, rewatching it now, there was a sense of sadness that I felt, knowing that this is the last drawing that Jack will ever do, but yet it's for her. Someone that he's truly in love with. Very bittersweet, and once again the music really adds that emotion. Then we get to the iceberg. and the film takes a complete 180 turn, showing up out of the dark, literally that close in front of them, and the moment you hear the words,
Iceberg, right ahead! Thank you.
then the movie goes into survival mode. The crew of the ship trying to stop it and reverse it, and just when you think it might miss the iceberg, nothing. I mean, anyone who knows the history of this event knows what's going to happen, but for some reason, the tension in this movie is very high. The fact that these characters are very captivating, at least on my end, that I think is what makes the movie very riveting. It still holds my attention on every viewing. And then as the sinking goes on, it just gets scarier and more chaotic. The officers telling women and children only, the men trying to fight for their place into the boats, Jack, Tommy, and Fabrizio trying to break their way through the gate by using that bench, and Tommy punching that guy who tells him not to go back there, women and young children not willing to leave their fathers or husbands behind, and then when we see people pushing and shoving each other, falling off of the ship as it starts to go higher and higher into the air, this really shows you that this is indeed a riot breaking out on an ocean liner, and I have no doubt that the actual event was more or less like that. So many moments in this half of the movie that are cathartic, tense, sad, and just plain jaw-dropping. Rose using the axe to break the handcuffs off of Jack. Even though I know she's able to break him free, I still tense up whenever she raises the axe. Her spitting in Cal's face makes me throw my fist up into the air saying, "Yes!" And on to the heartbreaking scenes where we see the Irish mother comforting her two kids knowing that they're eventually gonna die. The old couple laying in bed knowing that this is their last moment, with Near My God to Thee being played by the orchestral group. A moment that was parodied in the Simpsons movie.
Gentlemen, it's been an honor playing with you tonight.
Probably the one moment that really crushes me is when Tommy gets shot by Mr. Murdoch. And it's also a moment that a lot of people have raised issues with, that this is not exactly how Mr. Murdoch died. I read somewhere that his family didn't really like how his death was portrayed, and James Cameron had to issue a public apology for that. It's a movie, you gotta take creative liberties. With that knowledge in mind, I think that might have been a little too far. That's just me though. Also, this guy right here was Mr. Fantastic in the 2005 Fantastic Four. A couple years after I saw the first Fantastic Four, my mom pointed out to me, "Hey, that's Mr. Fantastic." And I looked really closely and I thought, oh my God, it is! And another heartbreaking moment for me is when Mr. Andrew says goodbye to Rose. And his character, along with the captain, there's a whole big world of pain that's brewing inside of them. Feeling that this is their ship and they failed everybody, hoping that they could actually make the ship indestructible because it was hailed as the unsinkable ship. Now that it looks like it might actually not be true, they feel like a failure. His goodbye to Rose hits a lot harder for me now. Victor Garber plays it beautifully. Then the ship gets higher and higher in the air, which gives us another famous image of a guy hitting a propeller on the way down. This is probably the least violent that I've seen of James Cameron's filmography, but even that moment, just the thought of that guy's legs hitting the metal. Yeesh. Just when you think it couldn't get any worse, a part of the ship breaks off. First time viewing and watching it now, my jaw is literally hanging to the ground. Just knowing that the film was a sweeping romance at one point earlier on, it makes the viewer watch these scenes in complete awe, like, what is going on here? Not to mention this shot, when Rose finally comes out of the water after the ship goes down, and she's looking around for Jack, and all these people are in the water screaming for help. But eventually she finds Jack, and he brings her to this floating door. They both try to get on, and Rose is the only one who can fit on. Okay, do I think Jack could have been on there? Yes, obviously he could have fit on there, but you could also argue, considering the weight of both of them, that they would just end up toppling over anyway. It was probably better for one person and not the other to survive. It's sad, but unfortunately it's the truth. And that's the thing with this whole half of the movie as the ship's going down. Everybody's trying to fend for themselves. Everybody's trying to fight their way to survival, to the lifeboats, to get out of the compartment areas, to break through the gates. When somebody's confronted with their own mortality, odds are they're gonna go crazy. This whole stretch of scenes where Jack makes Rose promise that she's gonna get out of this and she'll never let go of that promise. The officer searching for survivors amongst the group of people that are dead in the water, and then Rose eventually finding out that Jack has died.
Jack! Jack!
Yes, a lot of women have cried over this, and I've even heard some guys cried over this. Like Woody Harrelson apparently said that he cried at that moment. I did, obviously, when I first saw this. Watching it now, if I said that I didn't get emotional, I'd be lying to you. Because I did. But the thing I love about that is what happens after, when it cuts back to Rose in the present storyline. Everybody that's in the room listening to her, including her granddaughter, they start off very excited and interested to hear her story, but when we see their reactions, they're either crying or sitting in complete silence, just zoned in on what she's saying. Bill Paxton's character, Brock, who started off very greedy and wanting to find that diamond, by this point in the movie, he develops a better understanding of the Titanic. For 3 years, I thought of nothing except Titanic, but I never got it. I think it's a very underrated part of the movie. Someone who's really just captivated by the idea of the Titanic, the myth, the legend, for lack of better words. But when he hears the story from an actual survivor of the event, he develops a deeper understanding of the actual event. And I guess you can assume that he decides not to go through with the search after all. Maybe it's best to just leave it be. There's really no need to go digging around anymore. And even though she didn't end up with Jack, he had a significant effect on her life. In a very similar vein to how Rey takes on the Skywalker name in Star Wars Episode 9, she takes the name Dawson so nobody can find her, and eventually she was able to find someone and get married and have kids. But up until then, she's never talked about Jack. And as we see as she's lying in the bed with all those pictures she has by her side, she managed to keep her promise after all, living an extremely fulfilling life. And now that she's finally told her story about what happened on the Titanic, now she can let go and make peace with it. And it turns out she had the diamond the entire time. And when she lets it go in the water, probably not a surprise coming from me, it's very symbolic of her finally letting go of all those things that she's been holding on for so long. In regards to the film's ending, when we see her sleeping and the camera zooms in on the wreckage of the Titanic, and then it transitions into the ship as if it didn't go down, and then everybody's waiting for her, with Jack waiting at the top of the stairs, and they reunite. Some people have debated, is she dead and going into heaven, or is she having a dream? Me personally, I think this is her going to heaven. If you read any stories from people about their near-death experiences and how each one has a very different view of what heaven looks like, or limbo, or however you want to put it, I think I've come to realize that heaven is different for everybody. As someone who is a believer, I think it's safe to assume that heaven is very different for everyone. It's all going to depend on your perspective and what makes you comfortable, and I think God, in a way, makes heaven suitable for you. Whatever you think is right for you. And I think in the case of Rose, she'd rather be on the Titanic where nobody is feeling some type of class warfare, and that she gets to spend the rest of eternity with her true love. If that doesn't sound like paradise to you, I don't know what is. And if you're curious, the song My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion, I do have that song on my phone. And every once in a while, I like to listen to it.
Okay, come on, give it to me. Give it to my face, come on.
So in the end, the best way I can describe Titanic, it's an unbelievable movie. An incredible work of art. I'd go as far as to say that many, many decades from now, it could be considered a classic. A perfect blend of a sweeping romantic adventure mixed in with survival and disaster. None of it feeling out of place in the slightest. There's not just things in there for the women. There's stuff for the guys to enjoy too. So those are my thoughts on Titanic. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on Titanic. Hope you guys are having a great holiday season, and I'll see you in the next one.